My name is Evelyn Miller, and at 68 years old, I thought I had finally reached a season in life where nothing could surprise me anymore. I've lived through an unfaithful husband, long years of double shifts, and more nights alone than I care to count. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I saw when I turned into my driveway that Friday afternoon. The gravel under my tires popped like corn as my old pickup rolled toward the farmhouse I've spent 20 years paying off. I had just finished a hard week cleaning offices in town, the kind of week that makes your knees ache and your hands throb. I remember thinking that all I wanted was a hot bath, a warm meal, and maybe the quiet company of my chickens. It was the kind of exhausted longing that sits heavy in your chest. But then the world snapped in half. A white moving truck, huge, loud, completely out of place, was parked right in front of my porch. Its back doors were flung wide open, like a mouth ready to swallow whatever it wanted. Two men I'd never seen before were walking out of my house carrying my living room chairs. My chairs. The ones I bought secondhand but refinished myself, sanding them until the oak grain felt like silk. For a heartbeat, I thought I was dreaming, the kind of nightmare where your feet won't move and your voice won't work. But there was no waking up from this. Standing on the porch was my son, Jason, 42 years old, holding my coffee table as if it belonged to him. Right behind him was his wife, Courtney, tapping a clipboard and giving directions like she was running an estate sale. She didn't even glance toward the driveway. She just pointed inside the house and said, "Take the rest from the bedroom, next." One of the movers asked her if everything should go on the truck. "All of it," she answered. "Everything in the house." Something inside me cracked, not loudly but deep, like an old branch finally giving way. I didn't get out of the truck right away. I just sat there, breathing in dust and disbelief, watching strangers carry away pieces of my life. Jason laughed at something the mover said, and the sound of it felt like a slap. I realized then that neither of them had expected me to come home early. My hand shook when I reached for my phone. Years of being too trusting had taught me one late lesson. When your heart is screaming, your mind better get proof. I ended the engine, opened the door, and walked toward my own porch as if it were foreign ground. "Jason," I called, my voice thin but steady, "tell me what you're doing with my things." And that was the moment my entire world shifted. Jason eased the coffee table down onto the porch as if lowering a sleeping child, but there was no tenderness in the way he avoided my eyes. Courtney turned toward me with a startled blink, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip before she straightened her shoulders. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the creak of the porch boards and the distant hum of the truck filled the air. It felt like standing inside a storm before it breaks, everything tense, trembling, waiting. "I asked you a question," I said, stepping closer. "What are you doing with my things?" Jason swallowed. His voice came out rough, thin around the edges. "Mom, you weren't supposed to be home yet." "That's not an answer," I said. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent. "Why is my furniture being carried out of my house?" Courtney recovered first. She stepped forward like she was approaching a customer at a bank, her smile stiff and brittle. "Evelyn, you're taking this the wrong way. This is all part of what we talked about. Downsizing, making your life easier. Do you remember? We agreed this house is too much for you to manage alone." I stared at her. "We didn't agree to anything. I said the house gets lonely sometimes. And that was not an invitation to empty it." She lifted her clipboard slightly, tapping a page with her fingernail. "You signed the authorization. Jason said you understood the timeline. The buyer wants the property cleared by Monday, and we're just trying to get ahead so you don't get overwhelmed." "The buyer?" I repeated, each word burning a little. "What buyer?" I never put this house on the market. Jason flinched as if I'd struck him. He shifted his weight, glancing at Courtney before looking back at me. Mom, remember those papers Courtney brought? The ones we said would help us manage things if you had a medical emergency? Some of that paperwork included— You told me they were for doctors, I said. You said they were medical releases. Jason's shoulders sagged. It's not like we tricked you. You just didn't read everything carefully? The words slid under my skin like ice. I moved past them. Stepping inside the house, my living room looked gutted. The bookshelf where I kept family photos was stripped bare. The rug I bought with tips from a winter of overtime had been rolled into a tube and leaned by the door like a discarded flag. A mover brushed past me carrying the lamp my best friend gave me the year she died. Put that down, I snapped. He froze mid-step, eyes wide. When he set the lamp on the floor, it wobbled and the shade tilted crookedly. It felt like seeing someone bruise a memory. Jason hovered behind me. Mom, please don't make this harder. We're trying to help. You don't need all this space. You don't even use most of these rooms anymore. I turned to him. I use this whole house every day. I walk these floors. I sleep under this roof. I planted the trees outside and watch them grow. You don't get to decide it's too much for me. His lips trembled for a moment before he pressed them together. We thought it would be better if you moved closer to us. The kids miss you. It's hard driving all the way out here. If you lived in the city, if I lived in the city, whose decision would that be? Yours or mine? He didn't answer. His silence was an answer all by itself. Courtney stepped inside, her perfume overly sweet in the dusty air. We're not the villains here. Evelyn, you're acting like we're stealing, we're organizing. There's a difference. I pointed at the half-empty room, my voice tight. Does this look like organizing to you? She hesitated, just a flicker, but enough to betray the lie. We're doing what needs to be done. The truth settled into my bones then. They weren't helping me. They were moving me out, removing me, sweeping me aside like a problem that needed to be managed. I stepped toward Jason, close enough to see the tiny scar above his eyebrow from when he fell off his bike at 8 years old. Tell me the truth, I said softly. Whose idea was this? Yours or hers? His eyes flickered with something like guilt, small, fragile, quickly buried. We just want what's best, he whispered. No, I said. You want what's convenient. Outside, the movers shifted uneasily, sensing the tension through the walls. A breeze pushed through the open door and stirred the dust on the empty shelves. It felt like my house itself was holding its breath. I looked at the two people who should have loved me most. This ends now, I said, and the crack that had opened in my world widened just enough for the truth to shine through. When Jason and Courtney finally left that afternoon, the house felt hollow, the kind of hollow that has an echo. I stood in the doorway long after their cars disappeared down the road, trying to stitch my thoughts back together, but every time I inhaled, the scent of dust and disrupted memories filled my chest, and I knew I needed to get out of those walls before they crushed me. So I walked out toward the back field, past the apple tree that never grew straight and the clothesline that has leaned to the left for 10 years. The air smelled like damp earth and early fall, a scent I've always found comforting. But that day, even the familiar felt foreign, as if someone had nudged my world a few inches off center. I stopped by the fence overlooking the pasture and let my hands rest on the rough wood. I traced grooves in the grain with my fingertips, and that small, simple motion pulled me back through the years, to the woman I used to be, the woman who built all of this with nothing but stubbornness and a hope so thin it sometimes felt like smoke. I was 30 when I first found myself truly alone. Jason was 5, My husband had walked out 2 months earlier with a woman he'd met at the auto shop, leaving behind a half-written grocery list and a stack of unpaid bills. The savings account we'd built dollar by dollar was gone, emptied without a word. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, staring at the receipt from the bank, trying to decide whether anger or fear hurt more. There wasn't time for either. I had a little boy with dark curls and a too big backpack who depended on me. So I took every job I could. I cleaned motel rooms mornings, scrubbed the high school cafeteria after lunch, then worked nights wiping down the windows of the medical clinic. I learned which detergents cracked my skin and which left my knuckles only slightly raw. I learned how to sleep 5 hours without dreaming. I learned how to stretch a packet of chicken into soup for 3 days. Jason remembers some of that, though I tried not to let him see too much. I wanted him to feel safe, even when I wasn't sure how we'd pay the rent. I told him that good things come slowly, the way bread rises or trees grow, and I believed it. I had to. The dream that carried me through those years was simple: a home of our own. A place no one could take from us. A place where the walls didn't belong to a landlord who raised the rent whenever he felt like it. For years, it felt impossible. But I saved what I could. Tips tucked into coat pockets, change dropped into jars, envelopes slipped under the mattress. When I was 48, after nearly 2 decades of scraping by, I finally stood inside this farmhouse, old, drafty, but steady, and felt something settle in my ribs. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that I had survived. I signed those closing papers with hands that were trembling, not from doubt, but from relief. Jason was 16 then. He walked through each room, pointing out which corners would be perfect for his posters and where he wanted to set his stereo. I remember him saying the upstairs smelled weird, and I laughed because everything smelled weird, like old wood and dust and possibility. I painted every wall myself over the next year, working room by room on weekends. When money was tight, I bought furniture from yard sales and sanded it until the wood revealed its best face. I planted tomatoes behind the barn, hung wind chimes by the kitchen window, learned which floorboards squeaked and which ones held quiet secrets. This wasn't just a home. It was the place that stitched me back together. I told myself back then that Jason would always understand what this house meant, because he'd grown inside its walls as much as I had. I believed he carried the same memories. The first Christmas we spent here with the heater barely working, the time we chased a mouse out of the pantry, the mornings he'd come down the stairs rubbing sleep from his eyes and sit at the kitchen island while I packed his lunch. Standing by the fence now, staring at the fields turning gold in the late afternoon light, I realized how wrong I'd been. A house can hold memories, but it can't make someone keep them. Jason didn't see the years. He saw value. Courtney didn't see the sacrifices. She saw opportunity. And that truth lodged itself deep inside me, sharp enough to cut. I thought losing my husband had hardened me. I thought life had taught me every lesson I needed to learn. But standing there, listening to the wind rustle through the corn, I understood something new and terrible. A stranger can hurt you once, but when your own child betrays you, the wound keeps echoing. And I knew then that whatever came next, I couldn't let that betrayal take root any deeper. I had to protect what I had built, even if it meant fighting the people I loved. The next morning arrived with the kind of stillness that makes a house feel like it's holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, my body stiff from a night spent tossing between anger and disbelief. Even the chickens seemed hesitant to make noise, clucking softly as if they sensed the fracture running through my world. I fed them mechanically, my mind drifting back to every uneasy moment from the past few months, every offhand comment Jason or Courtney had made that I'd brushed aside. Little warning bells I ignored because I couldn't imagine my own son ever hurting me like this. When I finished my chores, I went back inside and stood in the living room, staring at the half-empty shelves. Sunlight streamed through the windows in thin, pale lines that fell across the floorboards, illuminating the dust the movers had kicked up. Something about the quiet felt wrong, as if the house knew something had shifted. I could either stay frozen in that moment or I could move. So I turned toward the kitchen drawer where I kept every piece of paper, every bill, every record. Years of scraping by had taught me that papers could save you or sink you. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread everything out in front of me. Bank statements, medical forms, property tax assessments, even the packet of coupons I'd never used. My fingers sought the papers Courtney had given me weeks earlier. They were tucked neatly behind an old electric bill, as if I had instinctively hidden them without knowing why. I unfolded them slowly, smoothing the creases with the side of my hand, and began to read. The words blurred at first. Legal phrases, dense paragraphs, terms I had skimmed before because Courtney had spoken quickly, and I had been tired, and I had trusted her. But with each sentence, I forced myself to read. Something cold and heavy settled in my chest. There it was, the power of attorney Jason and Courtney insisted would help in case of emergencies. A document granting Jason the authority to act for me in all matters pertaining to real property ownership, transfer, and representation. My name scribbled on the bottom, shaky from the flare of knee pain I'd had that day. A date I remembered all too clearly, rainy, my hands aching. Courtney pushing the stack of papers toward me while she talked about hospital visits and insurance. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I reached the last page. Tears gathered, but they didn't fall. They stayed right there, burning hot, refusing to let gravity win. I whispered into the empty kitchen. What have they done to me? Fear gave me momentum. I grabbed my purse, slipped the papers inside, and drove to the Maple Creek County building. The lobby smelled faintly of old coffee and fresh printer ink. A clerk with silver glasses and a knitted shawl greeted me with a polite nod. I told her I needed to check my property file. My voice trembled a little, but I kept talking. If I stopped, I knew I might crack. She typed my name into her computer, her eyebrows lifting slightly. One moment, Mrs. Miller. It wasn't a long moment, but it stretched, pulling tight like a string about to snap. When she returned to the counter, her kindness didn't hide the worry in her eyes. There's a pending transfer request on your parcel, she said gently. It hasn't gone through yet, but it's active. Active. The word hit me like a blow. I steadied myself against the counter. Can someone file that without me knowing? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. If someone with a valid power of attorney submitted the request, yes. The floor beneath me seemed to sway. My voice was barely a whisper. They were going to sell my house. The clerk touched my arm lightly. I'm so sorry. You should speak to an attorney right away. I walked outside in a fog, the crisp air doing nothing to clear the haze in my mind. I sat on a bench beneath an oak tree, watching sunlight flicker through its leaves, and tried to make sense of the betrayal rising in my chest. People passed on the sidewalk, laughing, chatting about errands and the weekend weather. Meanwhile, I felt like I was sinking into the earth. I couldn't go home. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face the rooms that suddenly didn't feel like mine. Instead, I drove to the larger town 20 miles away, to the community legal center that offered free consultations. I'd seen the building for years, but never imagined I'd walk through its doors needing help. Inside, a young receptionist asked for my name and a brief explanation. I handed her the papers without speaking. She glanced through them, her expression tightening. then told me to wait in one of the small conference rooms. That's where I met Maria Sanchez. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and warm eyes. Her voice had a steadiness that made me want to believe things could still be fixed. I told her everything, from the papers Courtney slid across my table to the moving truck parked in front of my house, to the buyer I never met and the signatures I never saw. Maria read every page carefully. When she finally looked up, her face held that kind of sadness professionals have when they've seen too much of the same story. "Evelyn," she said softly, "this is a broad financial power of attorney, far too broad, and the signature on the property transfer isn't consistent with your usual writing. This appears to be forgery." The word made my skin prickle. She placed a reassuring hand on mine. "But it's not too late. We can revoke the power of attorney. We can notify the county that no transfer is valid without your physical signature, and we can build a case to protect you." I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until it escaped me in a shudder. For the first time since seeing that truck, the world paused just long enough for me to gather my strength. Maria's voice stayed calm. "You're not alone in this. Evelyn, we're going to stop them." And just like that, fear began to melt into something sharper. Resolve. The morning they returned felt colder than the others, though the calendar insisted spring was near. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, listening for the rumble of an engine on the gravel road. Maria was parked behind the barn with 2 deputies, waiting quietly, giving me space but close enough if I needed strength that wasn't my own. When the white moving truck appeared again, my heart didn't drop the way it had before. It steadied. I watched the movers hop out with their gloves and blank expressions, blissfully unaware of the storm they were stepping into. Jason's truck followed close behind. Courtney pulled up last, stepping out with that same clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. They walked toward the porch as if this were just another chore on their list. Jason tried a gentle tone, almost pleading. "Mom, we don't have much time. The buyer—" "There is no buyer," I said, stepping down the porch stairs. My voice didn't shake this time. There was never a buyer. Just forged papers and a son who forgot who raised him. Courtney opened her mouth to argue, but Maria stepped into view before a single word escaped. The deputies followed her, badges catching the morning light. The change in Courtney's face was instant, first confusion, then fear, then anger, sharp and exposed. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," one deputy said, "you both need to step away from the property. There's an active investigation for attempted real estate fraud and forgery." Jason's eyes filled with something unsteady, something that looked a little like regret. "Mom, we didn't mean. You meant enough to try," I said, "and that's what counts." The deputies guided them back toward their vehicles. Courtney hissed something under her breath, but Jason looked at the ground the whole time, shoulders bowed under a weight he had created with his own hands. When their engines finally faded down the road, the silence that settled over the farm wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was earned. I walked back up the porch steps and let the warmth of the rising sun touch my face. I had lost something important that day. Trust. Maybe. But I had protected something greater. My home, my voice, myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.